This is a very special place. Some of my colleagues are tortured over whether to talk about abortion on these Yamim Noraim. I feel so blessed to serve a community where not only is support for reproductive freedom a given, but where the work to win that freedom is a shared commitment. So I don't need to answer the question, should abortion be legal or should we join this fight? Instead, we get to talk about how our tradition can guide our work. How can we stay in it? How can we avoid despair? How can we show up right? I'd like to explore together how the core framework of Yom Kippur can serve as a map to probe these questions. In the Unatan Tokef, we chant Teshuvah, Tefilah, Tzedakah, these beautiful banners by Hannah Lewis, Teshuvah, Tefilah, Tzedakah, Ma'avirin et roa hagzera. We're handed 3 keys to reclaiming our fates and shaping the future. I'm hopeful these ancient practices can offer a blueprint for showing up responsibly, sustainably, and effectively in such a critical moment. And we'll start with Teshuvah, atoning, healing, learning from the past. On Yom Kippur, we recite what is known as the 13 attributes. We sing, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun. We're reminding God of all of her loving attributes. She's merciful and loving. But the version in the Machzor is different from the original source in the Torah. The Machzor cuts out a controversial line. After all the stuff about how great and forgiving God is, the Torah essentially says, but don't think that God is a total softy. God visits the iniquity of parents upon their children to the 3rd and 4th generations. The omission indicates the editor's discomfort, right? And it certainly does seem unfair to be held accountable for the mistakes of your parents, your grandparents, and great-grandparents. But I hear this as more of a consequence than a threat. Of course we will feel the impact of our ancestors' wrongs, and the generations to follow us will feel the impact of our wrongs. What if we could experience this passing on, this bequeathing as a blessing rather than a burden? What if when we inherit the mistakes of our ancestors, we actually inherit a chance for deep learning, tikkun, repair, and a chance to right historical wrongs? As a white woman, I'm thinking especially about race. The so-called women's movement has actually been a white women's movement always. From voting access to pay equity, so much more. The needs of women of color have been an afterthought at best. White feminism controlled both the form and the function of the movement. The author of the book, White Feminism, Koa Beck, identifies one characteristic of white feminism as being very singular in its execution and its goals, singular. And one manifestation of this singular focus is on the legal right to abortion. Distinct from reproductive rights, the language of reproductive justice was formalized by women of color in 1994. Reproductive justice isn't just about the right to not have kids, but the right to have kids, the right to raise children in safety, and the right to bodily autonomy. While white women were hyper-focused on the legal right to abortion during the feminist movement of the 20th century, women of color were, and in some cases still are, experiencing the horrific impacts of other kinds of reproductive injustice, forced sterilization, losing their children to foster care, and other manifestations of white supremacy that target Black and brown families. Activists of color have never stopped organizing for reproductive justice because for them it was never just about legal abortion, and because for many women of color, Roe was more than precarious, it was fiction. Marcella Howell writes, "While eliminating this right may have shocked some people, for many Black women, abortion already was a right that could not be fully exercised. Because of funding restrictions, waiting periods, and other barriers imposed by federal and state policies, many of us spent the last 5 decades fighting for access to a right that others enjoyed." In other words, the right to abortion is only meaningful if you can get one. And the right to abortion is only part of the picture of what it means to achieve reproductive justice. Since the repeal of Roe, many of us are seeking ways to engage or re-engage in activism around rights and access to abortion. Those of us who have not intentionally engaged with the women's movement in an intersectional way are being offered an opportunity. We get a do-over. How can we follow the lead of directly impacted folks? How can we ensure a complex analysis of intersecting oppressions? In the words of Monica Simpson, director of the Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective Sister Song, "We can no longer see abortion as a single issue anymore. We can't talk about abortion without talking about voting rights. We can't talk about abortion without talking about environmental justice. We can't talk about abortion without talking about healthcare as a human right. Al chet shechatanu. We say for the mistake we have made. Teshuvah is a collective process, and in this case, intergenerational. Though none of us in this room are directly responsible for charting the path of this movement, we are responsible for participating in correcting its future course. The iniquity of the parents is visited on the children. And like with any Teshuvah process, some people in this room are atoning for it and changing their behavior, and other people in the room are forgiving the harms and healing themselves of its damage. We will not all relate to this Teshuvah process in particular in the same way, depending on our social location. Rashi's interpretation of this verse serves as a disclaimer. He says, the iniquities of the parents are only visited upon the children when, quote, they retain in their hands the evil doings of their ancestors. In other words, the next generation is culpable only when they follow the example of their parents. And isn't it true that we continue to carry out the same patterns they established? White feminism is alive and well. Collectively, our movements carry these wrongs, not just spiritually, but actively, right? This teshuvah is ours to make. May this oncoming wave of activism and organizing be an opportunity for us to both change and to heal. After teshuvah comes tefilah, prayer, cultivating perspective and imagination. Shortly after the Dobbs leak, iconic feminist Gloria Steinem was interviewed on NPR. I'm going to paraphrase. The interviewer asked if she was surprised, and she said, "No, this is ancient." The interviewer asked if she felt like her life's work was down the drain, and she said, "No, this is ancient." The interviewer was like, "But of course you must feel that your life's work is down the drain." And she said, "No. Women throughout history have found ways to take control of our reproductive health. The law is only one front in the battle." Her grace and perspective were breathtaking. her refusal to think in narrow, self-centered ways, her refusal to give into the overwhelming pull towards defeatism and binary ways of thinking. Incredible. She taught me that the struggle for reproductive justice isn't something that we can simply win or lose. Perspective. A sense of being part of something larger, longer, more complex. How can prayer help us to achieve this consciousness? It forces us out of the everyday, out of just our own individual experience and into a much longer arc of history. In Quest for God, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel writes, prayer takes the mind out of the narrowness of self-interest and enables us to see the world in the mirror of the holy. It's like a beam thrown from a flashlight before us into the darkness. It's in the light that we who grope, stumble, and climb discover where we stand, what surrounds us, and the course which we should choose. Prayer makes visible the right and reveals what is hampering and false. The imperative towards Tefilah, towards contemplation in a Jewish idiom, forces us into a broader relationship with time and history. I was so struck by Steinham's repeated use of the word ancient, right? How does placing our struggles in the context of millennia offer us grounding and perspective? What is the impact of invoking our most ancient ancestors every day? Or when we remember the sacrifices of the martyrs, as we do later in our service. When I came to Detroit for the U.S. Social Forum in 2010, I came across a striking installation. An artist had strung across dozens of beautiful posters. Her name was Heather Alt, and her project was called 4,000 Years for Choice. Each poster highlighted a practice from around the world and throughout history that gestating people employed to control their reproductive lives. For example, did you know that in 1500 BCE, the Egyptians used a contraceptive plug made from an acacia plant, honey, and lint? Or that ancient Roman physicians wrote about using wild cucumbers to end unwanted pregnancies? And we were there. Show and tell. This poster highlights from the Talmud. And it says that in the 5th century, Jewish Talmudic law suggested 3 groups of women: young girls, pregnant women, and lactating women avoid pregnancy by using sponges collected from the sea. Contraceptive sponges were later sold in mail order catalogs during the 1800s. So this is, I was seeing the Talmud there, seeing our tradition represented. I felt it just filled me with pride to see our culture represented in that history of, again, of women, of gestating people taking control of our reproductive lives. To be among these histories was revelatory. Despite a few courses in women's and gender studies, my thinking about this history had been extremely narrow. Abortion had been illegal. That was really bad. Then there was some Supreme Court case called Roe v. Wade, which made it legal. Thank God. But actually, the story is so much richer and complex and layered than that. Participating in justice movements always makes me feel a part of something bigger. But walking through that exhibit, I felt a part of something much, much bigger. Tefilah does this too. It reminds us that our stories are inevitably full of immense loss and grief, but also of resistance, resilience, and strength. And that these too will be the inheritances we pass on. And perhaps then, The practice of Tefilah serves as an antidote to the practice of Teshuvah. We will pay for the chata'im, for the mistakes of our ancestors, but we will also receive gifts beyond measure. We harvest the fruit of trees planted many years ago. I hope our Tefilah cultivates perspective and gratitude, and I also hope it cultivates imagination, giving us the courage to build the world we deserve. May our prayers be an assertion of possibility that is far from the landscape we currently inhabit. May our prayers tell the truth. Teshuvah, Tefilah, Tzedakah. Tzedakah, just action, redistributive justice. Tzedakah is where our beliefs are made actionable through the sharing of our resources and energy. The tradition understands this as meeting immediate needs, classically through money. But we know today that it takes all kinds of righteous action to move towards justice. How do our practices of Teshuvah and Tefilah lead us towards tzedakah, towards wise action? I'm going to offer a personal example. I'm someone who has a strong critique of charity and the nonprofit industrial complex. I have long preferred to mobilize for social change over direct service, and the tzedakah I give goes almost exclusively to groups organizing to impact policy and shift power dynamics. I resist donating towards services that I believe are the responsibility of the government, including abortion funding. But I personally have never been at risk of not receiving quality care if I ever needed an abortion. The repeal of Roe saw 50 years of precedent overturned. During the past 50 years, at least the right to abortion existed, even if not everyone had access. Now, for many people, that right has been removed, and access is even more precarious. The urgency for investing in community abortion care is even greater. As of yesterday, I'm a monthly supporter of our local abortion fund, as well as the national network of abortion funds. In their words, abortion funds have been navigating the difficult and evolving terrain of trying to get an abortion for a long time. We have decades of wisdom and experience assisting people over abortion barriers with compassion and care. While we don't always know what political changes will bring, we will always work to provide a safety net of care. That's why we're also fighting for everyone to have access to resources and support for all reproductive options in the future. Through the process of researching and writing this drash, thinking through each step of Teshuvah and Tefilah as they relate to reproductive justice, I have come to see my dismissal of direct service as being deeply connected to my privilege. White feminism is alive and well within me. Chatati. I'm embarrassed. It took me so long to see beyond this false and privileged binary, but I also feel gratitude for the chance to be in study with our tradition and with leaders of the reproductive justice movement, to be able to see where I was wrong and to help me initiate change grounded in humility, accountability, and action. In Deuteronomy, this is like the longest sermon I've ever given, y'all. I'm sorry, it was a really complicated topic, so I just got like another page, so stay with me. You're amazing. Okay, we're with me. Okay, in Devarim, in Deuteronomy, we hear the famous verse, Tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue. The rabbis offer many midrashim, theories, for why the doubling. Why does it say tzedek twice? Let's add a few of our own. Perhaps tzedek is meant to remind us that we are required to take multiple forms of action, energetic and financial, political and personal, systemic and individual. Perhaps the double word reminds us that we must fight both for reproductive rights and reproductive justice, for legality and access. And perhaps the doubling represents Teshuvah and Tefilah, because Tzedakah is where we get to put our learning, our healing, and our perspective into practice. Ma'avirin et roa hagzeira, disrupting the system and changing the future. This last clause is extremely enigmatic. Ma'avirin et roa hagzeira. The roa hagzeira is the badness or severity of the decree. Ma'avirin is something like redirects, overturns, subverts, queers, transforms. It shares the root of avera, a transgression. So the three practices of Teshuvah, Tefilah, Tzedakah can in some way mitigate or positively impact or even transform where we're headed. We are powerful. Ma'avirin also shares the root of ivri, Hebrew. So this overturning, queering, transgressing, it's in our DNA. Abraham changed the future. This is our legacy, and the legacy of all who call Abraham their ancestor. Transformation is made possible the more activated we become, the more engaged we are in accountability, truth-telling, and resourcing ourselves and each other. And transformation is dependent on us being able to reimagine the future we are seeking, not just rights, but access, not just abortion, but justice, not just legislation, but community action and redistributive justice. There is so much still to say, in particular, how this all connects to oppression of trans and gender nonconforming bodies. And there are so many things I don't yet understand. But what I do know is that we are incredibly blessed to belong to a tradition that offers us this space, these tools, and these relationships to engage in our fights for justice humbly, sustainably, and effectively. In the coming days, months, and years, may our Teshuvah allow us to grow and heal. May our Tefilah help us to connect and to imagine. And may our Tzedakah bring about the world in which everyone can exercise their right to not have kids, to have kids, the right to raise children in safety, and the right to bodily autonomy. May our work for reproductive justice help to build a stronger environmental justice movement, help to build a stronger abolitionist movement, help to build the world of chesed, loving kindness, of rachamim, compassion, and shalom, wholeness and peace that is ours to inherit and ours to pass on. Kain Yehi Ratzon, may it be God's will.